This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome, and thank you for watching NC Spin. Well, it's been an incredibly interesting week, and we're going to talk about it all, beginning with wondering whether or not our Supreme Court justices might face impeachment, or whether the legislature will clarify the wording on two constitutional amendments the court said couldn't be on the ballot in November. Monday night Silent Sam toppling has reverberated all across the nation, and our panel's going to discuss that incident as well as the decision by the Historical Commission this week. If there's time, we want to ask about whether UNC's football team should boycott the NCAA over the sale of football shoes, and as always, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. We got a stellar panel this week. They include former Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr, John Hood, syndicated columnist and journalist, Chris Fitzsimon, senior political analyst and also columnist, and Rufus Edmisten, former Attorney General and former Secretary of State. We're going to begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Did you know 80% of North Carolina's harvest is made into food products in other states? That's why food scientists at NC State are partnering with industry and government to turn local crops into North Carolina products, creating new opportunities for our farmers and businesses and adding jobs in rural communities. At NC State, what we think and do grows our economy from seed to supermarket. Discover how we're growing new food opportunities. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
Let's get started. Last Friday, at a meeting to discuss the 6 constitutional amendments on the November 6th ballot, Dallas Woodhouse, executive director of the state Republican Party, suggested that if the Supreme Court ruled against the constitutional amendments, they could be impeached. Well, guess what? A 3-judge panel said 2 of the amendments didn't pass muster and couldn't appear on the ballot. Bob Orr and Rufus Edmisten, I want to ask you both, what now? The legislature has gone into special session, and even as we are recording this show, Becky Gray, one of our fellow panelists, is over there, and it's going to keep us up on what happens during that period of time. But in the event that the legislature changes language for these 2 constitutional amendments, which we'll discuss in just a minute, do you think it's going to be enough for the 6 former Supreme Court Chief Justices and 5 former governors to support these 2 amendments? Bob Orr?
No, I don't think it will be enough. I think the 2 amendments in question, particularly the judicial one, is just simply bad public policy. So I think the opposition will continue to that. There are major changes proposed on the appointments issue, so you may get the former governors backing off of their opposition to that.
Rufus?
Well, I think our friend Dallas, who made that pronouncement, is in Alice in Wonderland, curiouser and curiouser, and he should have read.
That's just Dallas being Dallas.
And that's Dallas being Dallas, and he apparently didn't read the book of Proverbs, which said, "He who guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles." It is probably one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. Who in the world? What have they done? You can only impeach somebody under our statute if they've committed a felony, a misdemeanor, or malfeasance in office, and I think the other one is failure to carry out your duty. So where does that fit? Is ruling in a certain way a failure to carry out duty? Pure tomfoolery.
Well, it keeps pundits like us full of things to talk about.
I think what the intent of it is to try and subtly or not so subtly intimidate the judges and remind them that the legislature has the big club in all of this and the last word. So that's the offensive part about it.
All right, John, let's talk about the changes that the legislature has proposed for these 2 amendments, starting first of all with the State Board of Elections changes.
Well, remember that the constitutional amendment that was originally put on the ballot started with what Republicans tried to do a couple of different times and were unsuccessful in sustaining their legislation through those courts. So now they want to change the Constitution to have an equally balanced bipartisan ethics and elections board. But in addition to that, and this is what really drove the immediate opposition from the former Govs and others, is that there was this general language that the legislature is going to control appointments to boards and commissions, which was a response to the lawsuit that Governor McCrory brought with some former governors. They won on that, and this was a way to put the legislature back in charge of staffing what are essentially administrative boards and commissions. Under the plan they apparently are now going to enact, that comes out completely, and it's just about the Elections Board. First of all, I think, as Bob says, that will reduce or eliminate some of the opposition from former officials. I think that it also fundamentally makes this much less objectionable. Now it's just about the Elections Board.
Chris, you agree with that?
I agree that that amendment, I still will vote against it. I think it's a bad idea. But I think it does remove a lot of the objections that the three-judge panel had. I think the other one, the one about judicial vacancies, is also terrible public policy, as Bob said. I think that's not quite as clear to me if it answers all the objections of the judges.
Boy, I looked at the language on that judicial appointments for vacancies, and it's...
Well, you can't read it. It's only a 30-minute show.
Exactly. I mean, it is lengthy. Do you think the average voter is actually going to take the time to read all that?
Well, I mean, that's true that we've had constitutional amendments on the ballot in the past that were lengthy or lengthier than that the voters did enact. It is possible some people, in fact, we know that a number of voters will not get all the way to the amendments and cast a ballot. We've seen that in the past. But honestly, the rewritten, whatever you think about the policy, the rewritten version of that judicial selection amendment is much better. It clearly identifies the stages. The previous one really didn't do that.
Bob, but let's play this now.
Sure.
Okay, so the legislature passes this revised wording. Does it have to go back before the three-judge panel for approval?
Yes, that was one of the two options the three-judge panel gave the defendants, the state, the legislature, and that was you can appeal and or you can go try and get it right. So they're going to go back, try and get it right.
Well, they got the appeal going on too at the same time.
Well, it's a dual track, and I don't believe that the plaintiffs in the case are going to accept the revisions, but it'll go back to the trial
Rufus,
court.
you were our Secretary of State and our Attorney General for a number of years. We're running up against some hard deadlines here. These absentee ballots need to be printed, and supposedly absentee voting begins September 7th.
I do remember that happening when I was Attorney General.
So what's going to happen? I mean, if we've got to go back before the judges, and let's just say any kind of snafu takes place, we could be having
somebody's going to have to get on the ball, and I think our courts are up to it. They have become really the arbiters right now of what goes on in North Carolina, forced upon them because the legislature and the governor have had so many disagreements, and I think they'll come up to the
Do you suppose the Supreme Court or the court, I mean, I thought it was interesting, the legislature wanted to go to the Court of Appeals.
Right.
The governor wants to go to the Supreme Court. Tell us why.
Well, because obviously they both perceive they have an advantage there, but ultimately if it goes to the Court of Appeals, depending on the ruling, that could go to the Supreme Court too. I thought one of the most unfortunate comments, Senator Berger said we need to stop this unnecessary litigation. What he was referring to was the decision by a three-judge panel appointed by the Republican Chief Justice that found this was unconstitutional. So that doesn't sound like unnecessary litigation to me. It sounds like poor legislating.
So I'm going to ask each of you the question I asked Bob Orr. Have they changed with what they're proposing enough of the objectionable information or concepts of this so that the 5 former governors and the 6 former Supreme Court Chief Justices will, the 6 justices says we ain't going to vote for these 2 amendments?
The appointment of judges, no.
So you're still not going to get their approval?
You're going to get it in the courts where they're going to get it.
No, I agree that with Rufus. The officials will still be against the judicial selection one for vacancies. I'm not sure all of them will be against the Elections Board being bipartisan.
Bob?
The question is not the governors and the former Chief Justices, but what does the current three-judge panel and appellate courts think about it?
I hear you. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any question the former governors will be opposed to the judicial changes. I think there's probably 50-50 on the Elections Board, and I hope Dallas Woodhouse stops talking about impeachment.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It's entertaining. Come on, guys.
Offensive. It's entertaining. But that's the problem with their politics. It's offensive, actually.
I actually do not think that was seriously offered as a real possibility. I do not believe.
Wait a
brought up
minute. He
reminded
tried defending this.
I understand that.
All right, I want to switch gears.
Serious
Monday night, a group of estimated 200 people gathered on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill, covered the statue of Silent Sam, and then later toppled the monument to soldiers from UNC killed in the Civil War. Their actions set in motion some heated debates across our state and nation, for that matter. The debates that continued Wednesday when the North Carolina Historical Commission's Confederate Monument Study Committee voted to keep 3 federal statues on the Capitol grounds, also saying they needed additional signage or context about the statues, as well as adding memorials to African Americans and other groups. I want to ask John and Chris. Let's begin by getting your comments on the actions of the protesters. Chris?
Well, this is not the way these monuments should have been taken down. I'm glad that Silent Sam is down. And I was thinking a lot about 2 things. One is you said it was to the soldiers in the Confederate or the Civil War. It was also to white supremacy, as we've talked about many times on the show. The dedication speech to that monument was given by Julian Carr, who talked about how delighted he was to horsewhip a Negro wench and what a pleasurable experience it was. And he was a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. So let's don't act like this monument was to the Confederate war dead. This monument was to white supremacy. And I was thinking about all the African American students and housekeepers and professors that have walked by that monument their entire lives at UNC, knowing that it was dedicated to say that they're an inferior race.
John,
that does not mean we should have taken it down by a mob, but it means that the frustration and the things that have happened in this state for the last 100 years have never been fully addressed.
John, you wrote an article about this, one of your syndicated columns a couple of weeks ago, and then you followed it up by a column in the Wall Street Journal this past week, which was pretty strident on your part.
Well, it was comments to the Journal.
Okay.
But what I would say about this is, this was a mob committing crimes in front of police officers who stood by. So, Julian Carr, by the way, did not represent everybody associated with the monument. He was a racist scumbag, okay? But others involved in that were honoring their fathers and grandfathers. It's a complex story. That makes absolutely no difference. Where we are right now is the statue has to go back up. It has to be guarded from future attack. The people who were involved in the episode who can be identified need to be arrested and prosecuted. The police officers who refused to participate in doing their jobs, either because they were ordered to stand down or else need to be investigated. Why did you stand by and watch this? Among other things. There are many other aspects to this. But these were individuals who got up on a heavy statue, apparently used blowtorches and ropes, endangered themselves and others. It is the responsibility of the police to stop that immediately, not stand by and watch it.
Rufus, UNC Chancellor Carol Holt has taken a lot of criticism this past week. Her leadership in this whole affair was being questioned largely because the campus police, among others, as John said, didn't proactively try to protect the statue as it was coming down. What do you think about her role and the university's role in this?
As hard as I've tried to be empathetic, I went to Chapel Hill for 4 years. I walked past that statue of Silent Sam and did not ever have any racial bias about what it stood for. The administration, my comment goes back to what John said. What in the world were those police officers doing? And that rests with the university. And I don't know what in the world law enforcement officers are doing there, letting people come around and build a wall around where you couldn't see what they were doing. No matter how you feel about these things, and Chris gave a good description. These were Jim Crow laws that put them up. You cannot allow people to destroy property, and the university allowed that to happen, and I'm disgusted.
So now we got a real Donnybrook, Bob Moore, because I mean this is bringing emotions to the fore like we haven't seen discussed in quite some time. Members of the Board of Governors, for instance, are calling for action to be taken here. The restoration of Silent Sam, punishment.
Well, I would make 2 observations. One is, I do think that the leadership of the university and the university system and the state have abjectly failed in creating a constructive dialogue about how to address Confederate memorials and the like. Instead of focusing on statues, we need to be focusing on the racial divide and the tensions across the country and how do we address them. And Secondly, I think that having failed to do it, we need to be talking about solutions, not wedge issues that separate
and whether
us.
we can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And contrast all of this, Chris, with what happened Wednesday with the State Historical Commission, who said that they wanted to leave the 3 Confederate statues on the grounds of the Capitol. But they acknowledged, in their words, the overrepresentation and over-memorialization of a difficult era in NC history. Why?
Well, let's remember that the law was changed by the General Assembly
in
2015, which is another complaint I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten in this whole process, which makes it much more difficult for local governments or state agencies to take down, or not just take down, but move. When this thing first happened after Charlottesville, after Charleston, a lot of people, including me, thought these monuments shouldn't be destroyed. They should be taken to museums or battlefields. I don't think it's appropriate when an African-American citizen walks to his state capitol or her state capitol or a courthouse that they're reminded of that. There's a place to do it, but I agree with Bob. We've never had a real a conversation about this, and I think some of the political leaders who are now so outraged are a little disingenuous about calling for a conversation with people with good faith when we're changing the laws. We're changing the laws to make it harder. And number two, one great thing could have happened after Charleston. We had an opportunity to stop selling Confederate battle flag license plates. The state of North Carolina, Governor McCrory asked the legislature to stop doing that. They refused. So there's a lot of issues that are all swirling around here.
Do you see the legislature willing to change this law at all?
Absolutely not. I think they will tighten up so that it will be almost impossible.
And political polls, John, have shown that
most North Carolinians do not want the memorials taken down. And that doesn't mean they wouldn't want to take some other actions. And I think that you could get broad bipartisan support for example, adding context to the objects that currently exist. Imagine taking Julian Carr's words and putting them right next to Silas Hand. That would be an excellent way of educating people about what was going on at that time. And similarly on the Historical Commission's work on the Capitol grounds, but putting this context. But the main thing is, why not put up new monuments, new memorials? There is a pre-existing plan for the North Carolina Freedom Park, which would honor the struggle of African Americans in North Carolina, their accomplishment of freedom. That has been on the books for years. They've been trying to raise money for it. Get that put up. It's right next to the Capitol.
Meanwhile, this is just becoming more and more and more divisive. Is this going to be an issue in November for the election?
Sure. It's a wedge issue, and we're seeing more and more of that divides our state, our communities, our country on things that really shouldn't be that important in the greater scheme of the issues we're facing. I mean, people are more concerned about Silent Sam being torn down than the Russians interfering with the election.
So does it help or hurt Republicans or Democrats, John?
The mob action in Chapel Hill might as well have been a covert action by Republicans, because now the conversation has not much to do about the propriety of putting Silas Sam up 100 years ago. It has to do with, are we going to have a rule of law or not? Do people get to take the law into their own hands, engage in crime, and get away with it? That's the issue now.
Chris?
It was a crime for those African-American men in Woolworth not to leave that lunch counter when the police told them to. Jesse Helms famously said in 1999, he was asked, looking back all the things he said about the Civil Rights Movement, he said, I think it was unnecessary. As if we would have all done that on our own out of goodwill. I'm not condoning what they did, but civil disobedience, we can argue whether this is it or whether this is violence or whatever, but there have been plenty of times in our history where people have broken the law that they thought was unjust.
If Carolina had done the display that John talked about a moment ago, none of this would be happening at the moment. It will not go away, though, as long as people destroy property. That is the basic right of the American Constitution, the North Carolina Constitution. Property rights, whether they're owned individually or by the state.
But Bob, it's gotten to a point where it is more than just the toppling of a statue, correct?
Yeah, it has. I mean,
you said it was a wedge issue.
It is a wedge issue. It's symbolism. It's conservatives versus liberals, radicals versus traditionalists, and that's not what the conversation needs to be talked about now. And I've got to add, Confederate monuments are really monuments to the failure of society to solve problems without killing each other.
And we must add that most of them were actually constructed in the early 1900s.
Right, white supremacy.
They've been up there for some time. Silent Sam.
At the behest, by the way, Tom, of the women of the Confederacy.
United Daughters
of the Confederacy.
And look, it was 50 years later. There was both some people doing it for white supremacist messaging reasons, and daughters and granddaughters 50 years after their fathers and brothers and so forth went off to war, putting up monuments to them. Both of those things were happening at the same time.
The right and wrong here is very clearly evident, isn't it, Chris?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I still think I just can't get over the fact that we've had African American citizens who have walked by these monuments for their entire lives.
Okay, well, we got to cut that off at some point in history and say, okay, that was wrong.
Well, do we? When we have a president who said there are fine people on both sides and some of them are white supremacists, do we have to? Are we cutting it off or not?
Good point.
No. I'm not sure we're cutting it off.
Maybe we should. Well, perhaps you saw the story, speaking about UNC Chapel Hill, perhaps you saw the stories about UNC Chapel Hill football players who sold shoes they had been given, fairly expensive shoes, I might add, and they were penalized for so doing by having to sit out the first few football games of the year. Now, Bob Orr, you wrote a very interesting op-ed piece in the Charlotte Observer a couple of weeks ago in which you criticized these penalties by the NCAA and went further by saying you thought the players ought to strike a blow for players' rights and send the NCAA a message by boycotting the season. Tell us why you said that.
Well, it's a ridiculous rule. The only reason these young men were given these shoes that apparently have a value of several $1,000s was so they could be walking billboards for the company and the university. But then having given these kids really expensive shoes, some of them, for whatever reason, turned around and sold them. And then they get punished for it. And I can't think of another situation in the country where somebody could sell a pair of shoes that they had been given and then they get punished. All the while the coaches, the university are making hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars off of these clothing contract agreements. And it's just fundamentally wrong. And the only way this is going to stop is when the players say, you know what? That's right. We're not going to California. We're going to stay in the library and study this upcoming Saturday.
Well, no, wait a minute. Let's don't go quite that far.
Well, that's what a boycott's about. You know, I mean, they're students. They're supposed to be students.
So Rufus, as former Attorney General, what do you think would happen if Carolina's football team decided they were going to boycott the season?
It'd be like a dog had been running a hound for 3 days. They would drop dead and totally capitulate. And what I'm going to even go further than Bob. I think we ought to pay players a stipend so they don't have to do stuff like that. Selling shoes, it's untoward, but I can't blame them. But when you see other people on campus having everything they want, and you get nothing, and you're making the university millions of dollars.
Let's just really speak to the problems that we've got in amateur athletics today.
Well, absolutely, and it's worth noting this past week that Ohio football coach Urban Meyer was suspended for 3 games for overlooking the domestic violence past of one of his assistant coaches. So he was punished less than a kid in Chapel Hill who sold a pair of shoes.
Interesting. John, you think you're not our big sports fan on this panel.
That is certainly the case.
All right, so you can take an objective
Absolutely
position.
objective.
All right, what is your position?
My position is simply that college sports is a professional business in which some of the players are not, some of the people participating in the business, the workers are not paid. The end.
Okay, so this is a labor rights issue.
It's not amateur. There's nothing amateur about it. It's a large-scale professional national business in which some of the workers are unpaid. Is that the system we want?
I told you folks this was an interesting week. Well, it's going to get even more interesting right now because we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon.
Well, it's interesting. The state voters in Michigan this fall will have a chance to vote on whether or not to set up an independent redistricting process in the state of Michigan. Our General Assembly is meeting this week to put amendments on the Constitution or to change the language. Why not an amendment to give the constitutional authority to an independent commission to draw legislative districts, a plan that Senator Phil Berger sponsored 5 times when he was a member of the minority in the state Senate?
Interesting. Rufus Edmisten, tell us something we don't know.
With all this separation of powers business going on, I hearken back to 1982 when I gave a ruling that the legislature had put themselves on all these boards and commissions, the Bone decision. And one of the members of the Senate said Edmisten's gone crazy. Well, the Supreme Court.
This was the Advisory Budget Commission.
The Advisory Budget Commission. And so we're back into, there's nothing new. It was Democrats against Democrats.
All right, Bob Orr, tell us something we don't know.
Judge Allison Duncan is taking senior status from the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, opening up an opportunity for the president to appoint a North Carolinian to replace her. I hear the inside track is a former law clerk for Judge Dave Sintel and Clarence Thomas, who is the executive director of the Judicial Watch Group.
You're going to name a name?
Yes, Carrie Severino.
Okay.
And that will create a lot of controversies.
That's something important. Okay, John.
There's a new organization in the state called North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. Bob and I are both on the boards of that. They will be placing an amendment. I believe it will successfully be placed on the ballot in 2020 to reform North Carolina's redistricting process.
Good news. All right. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day to stay informed all during the week. Give your feedback, read my weekly column, and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Did you know 80% of North Carolina's harvest is made into food products in other states? That's why food scientists at NC State are partnering with industry and government to turn local crops into North Carolina products, creating new opportunities for our farmers and businesses and adding jobs in rural communities. At NC State, what we think and do grows our economy from seed to supermarket. Discover how we're growing new food opportunities. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.